But in the topic, the story that I was really going to spend some time on is the story of David, and we just spent months talking about stories of David. So I'm actually going to over portions of the story of David tonight for the sake of time, but I do still want to talk about David himself and the way that he made decisions and some of the principles that we learned, that especially the principle of when we choose to do nothing. Because that's a part of this idea of decision-making that we don't often think about, and probably sometimes we even default to as if that is a good thing to do, to choose to do nothing, because then we don't make the wrong decision. But oftentimes that also leads to disaster, and I hope you'll see that by the time we're done with this evening's lesson on this topic. So David, when we are introduced to him as a young man, is introduced as an exceptional young man. He is talked about before he is talked about. In chapter 13, you've got Saul, who has chosen to offer sacrifices that Samuel is supposed to offer, that is disobedient to God. And Samuel makes a statement here in this chapter that I think is important. Start with me there. 1 Samuel 13, verse 13. Samuel says to Saul, "You have been foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have established permanently your reign over Israel, but now your reign will not endure." Now, get this. Had you done the right thing in this moment, God was going to establish your throne forever. Now, keep reading with me. "The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not done what the Lord commanded." God had a backup plan. I don't know if you realize that. David wasn't plan B because plan A didn't work out. David was already in place, chosen by God, as the man who had a heart that was after God's heart. And that, I think, is important to recognize. David is recognized from the very first time he is talked about as being a remarkable man. Later on, you've got Samuel going to the house of Jesse, and he chooses David, and David is the youngest son out in the field, and God announced, this is the one who is chosen. And we're not really given a lot of details there, except for, we assume, that detail's not really included. God, but the next time we read about him, he's trusting in God, so we assume when God shows him that his trust in God would have led him to accept God's calling. And then you get to chapter 17, where David himself is talking to Saul the king, and he makes this statement. Starting in verse 34, he says, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from it. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it." I have always been amazed by this statement. Here's a young shepherd boy, he's probably late teenager by this time, but he's a young man who is willing to face off against a lion or a bear. And not just face off from a distance with his sling, hiding from around the tree, right? That's the way, if I had to face off with a lion and bear, I'm going to have some sort of cage or to be up in a tree. Somehow there's going to be some separation between me and this wild animal. How about you? He grabs it by its fur and hits it. Sit down. It's amazing to see this kind of courage. Different men for different times, right? They just did things differently back then than we do today, where I get a little creeped out. The birds sound funny at night. It's amazing to see the kind of courage David had. He is an impressive young man. He stood even when everybody else should have been the one standing first. You come to chapter 17 where you've got this David and Goliath story, and he is willing to go into the battle even though he is not himself a soldier. You realize this is not his. He has been hearing the taunting day after day of this giant soldier on the other hill across the valley. He is not this his battle. But the army wouldn't step up. Even his brothers, his older brothers, the ones he's supposed to be able to look up to, they're not stepping up to meet the challenge. The king, who is heads and shoulders taller than everybody else in Israel, not stepping up to meet the challenge. There's nobody in all of Israel who is willing to face off against Goliath. Yet he does it even when it doesn't make sense. He is a man who is described as being beautiful. Beautiful. Okay? I don't know exactly what all is implied in that statement, but he's not a man who is described as strapping. You realize that? He's not described as like, muscular and fit. He's described as good looking. Now, he is courageous, and he becomes the general in Saul's army because he's willing to trust in God. He's willing to do what nobody else is willing to do, even when it doesn't make any human sense. But it is his faith that makes him successful, not his muscles. It is his courage that makes him successful because he trusts that God will take care of him. So you look here in chapter 17, in verse 37, you've got statements like this. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. That's the idea. And really, in the Hebrew, he's essentially calling the Philistine a mere animal, just like the lion and the bear. He's saying, the Lord will rescue me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. He'll rescue me from this paw of a Philistine, of the Philistine himself. He's just one more animal that God can protect me from. When he's facing off with Goliath, Goliath comes out and starts laughing at him, starts kind of jabbing at him and making fun of him and talking about how little and puny he is. Listen to what he says. Verse 45. David said to the Philistines, you come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord. He will hand you over to us. There's a couple of interesting things in faith that I think I'm pointing out. One is his confidence in when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a similar statement, right? They said, our God can deliver us, and he will deliver us, but if he doesn't deliver us, it doesn't change the fact that he's God. I kind of see the same sort of confidence here in the way that David words this to Goliath, right? That God can do this. God is going to do this, and I'm just going to come in there, and I'm going to do the job that I have to do. Listen to this. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves. You know, this whole assembly could be in reference to the assembly of the Philistines. You know what I think it's actually in reference to? The assembly of the uncourageous, unfaithful people behind him. This is David's first moment, his people toward faith in God. And he's saying, that God will do this and prove to not just y'all, but prove to us that he is God and he does not need our swords or our spears to accomplish his task. He can do it by a nobody like me. Isn't that amazing? That kind of courage, that kind of faithfulness. And you see that being essentially his character as he moves forward. He's rewarded for his faith. He's given the daughter of Saul, second daughter, and there's all sorts of differences matter. He's going to trust in God. He's going to, even on the run, even during his weaker moments, continues to reward him and hold him up so that God can fulfill his promises through David. David is impressive as the decision maker. But then we know David makes the bad decision, right? 2 Samuel chapter 11, you've got the story of David and Bathsheba and that horrible episode. There's all sorts of details we can go into about this story and all sorts of assumptions with you that I think are true based on the story and based on the details we have. One is this. We know, because of the way it's worded, 2 Samuel chapter 11, David is not where he is supposed to be, right? It says there, in the spring when kings march out to war. So where should kings be? With their armies in the war. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel. Is David where he is supposed to be geographically? No. David shouldn't even be at home. But he is. But I think there's more to it than that. As you keep reading, David got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace. He's up there walking to and fro, back and forth, wandering around on the roof. And that could be he's strolling, he's pacing because he's worried about the war. He could be worried about his armies. He could be worried about some sort of administrative detail that he's got to make a hard decision about. Maybe. But he's up there at a time of the day when he probably shouldn't be up there. The time of the day when people are getting cleaned. The time of the day when people are taking their baths. And while the palace roof is way up above the other rooftops and the courtyards and the other places down below, he's up there walking around, looking around, and probably seeing things he shouldn't see. And it says that Bathsheba he sees this woman who's naked, who's bathing, and she's a very beautiful woman. Now I know I've had people argue with me over the years that he really would not truly have been able to see much of anything from that distance. He thought she was a very beautiful woman. That was clear. So I don't know how much he could see. I've not personally strolled around on David's rooftop of his palace. But he could see enough to know this was something he wanted. Not only that, I wonder if this wasn't a single occurrence. We're told about this instance. But it is hard to believe that a man goes from the kind of man who we see as being a man of purity, a man of God's will, a man who loves God's law, to immediately adultery. There typically is some sort of lead down that wrong pathway. And I wonder if this is not an uncommon occurrence, and here's why. We're given the detail in verse 4 that he sent her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. Now she had just been purifying herself from all her uncleanness. And there is question as to whether that is an uncleanness based off of their night escapade or whether that is a ritual uncleanness based on her regular scheduling. And based on what we know about the way they would try to control families and those types of things, if he knew, that might be a great opportunity for him to get away with some sin. And I wonder if there wasn't some more premeditative and thoughtfulness that went into planning getting away with this kind of sin. Second of all, what we find is that he's not where he should be spiritually. That's clear in the fact that he's willing to break the law. He's not just willing to break the law, but he's willing to break, assuming we're correct about her ritual purification, he's willing to break multiple laws. Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 20, you're not to have sexual intercourse with your neighbor's wife, defiling yourself with her. That's one piece. But then you get over to chapter 20 and verse 18. It says, if a man sleeps with a menstruating woman and has sexual intercourse with her, he has exposed the source of her flow and she has uncovered the source of her blood. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. And so if he's planning to get away with some sin because he can time it just right, he's violating multiple laws here. And then there's the issue of the fact of what he does relationally. And we spent some time on this in our previous series as we talked about Ahithophel. But he knew this woman. Even though he asked, who is this woman? And his servant up there says, is this not Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, No, I'm getting that. Now I've got to look it up. Is this not the? Is not there? You go, Eliam. Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife? Now here's the deal. He knew who Bathsheba was, and we know he knew who Uriah was because Uriah was one of his mighty men, and we know that he knew who Bathsheba's father was because his name is mentioned here, and he is also one of David's mighty men with him during his wanderings away from Saul. And he knows who Bathsheba's grandfather is. It's Ahithophel, who is one of his most trusted advisors, who has regular access to David. This is a well-connected family. This is somebody that David would have been very acquainted with. And it is even kind of hard for me to believe that he didn't know who it was just based on where she lived. If she was bathing around her own property, maybe it was a common bathing space, and so maybe that one doesn't make any sense. But, I mean, you've got this idea of, while David is acting like he doesn't know who this person is, it's very obvious that he does know who this person is. David is trying to get away and justify sin. He, in my understanding of this story, he chooses sin until he finally closer and closer and closer and closer to sin, and he had every opportunity through the process to call it, not engage in this sin. He shouldn't have been where he was. He shouldn't have been there possibly more often than as often as he was. He had the opportunity to say no because of who it was and his connection to the family, and that he loved her husband and he loved her father and he loved her grandfather. He should have stopped this every step of the way. David doesn't just make a bad choice in the moment. David makes a lot of bad choices, and that leads to a disaster. And we know a lot of the story as it follows the punishment that David endured because of his sin, that he lost. But he does marry Bathsheba, and he ends up having Uriah killed and trying to cover up his sin. And there's all sorts of pieces of the story that move forward. And we also know, because we've studied the life of David, that David's life is a dive from this point on. And things just get worse and worse and worse for David. He's still a great king, but he just turns into a disaster. When you compare the end of his life with the beginning of his life, do you not see a stark contrast between the two men? David at the end is merely a shadow of the David God called in the beginning. Part of that you see in the whole story with Amnon. Amnon, David's firstborn, makes another horrible choice, and he decides to betray his own half-sister and sins against her. And David does nothing about it. Nothing. It almost, if you didn't know David knew it happened, because it lets us know that, you would think David didn't know it happened. Because he does nothing to protect his family, his daughter, or to deal with the sin that has occurred in his family. As a result, we've spent time on it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight. But as a result, if you remember the story, Amnon is killed. He gets killed by his own brother Absalom. And another son is lost, meaning Absalom, because Absalom now has to go on the run and disappears for several years and has an estranged relationship with David because he's angry at David because of David's inaction and inability to deal with the moral implications of what his oldest son has done. Absalom gets so angry that he ends up turning the city against David and stealing the throne from him. David loses essentially everything. And then eventually the throne is restored to David, but he loses Absalom also. Absalom dies. David's inactivity caused an absolute disaster. You know, the Bathsheba story back in chapter 7 was, and we often refer to that as being the bad moment of David's life. But I'm going to tell you, it seems to me that the story at the end with Amnon and Absalom and Tamar and all the disaster that happens here is way worse. I mean, if I have to gauge the way his life is going, this part of his life is way more in the pits than the Bathsheba story. He could deal with Bathsheba because it was his own sin. He refused to deal at all with this. And it caused not the death of one son, but the death of one infant son. This causes the death of two adult sons and what naturally would have been the heir to the throne, and the loss of the throne, and the disaster among God's people, and all sorts of stuff. Then as you keep moving the story forward, as we remember from a couple of months ago, the story of his son trying to take the throne away from Solomon because David won't do the job of announcing that Solomon will be the next king, even though that has been proclaimed by God himself. Won't confirm it. David won't say this is what's going to happen because David doesn't want to make a decision. And it leads to a whole nother disaster and the death of another son. When good men do nothing, it leads to disaster. It just does. Turn with me over to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. There's a whole section here. My Bible subtitles it Light versus Darkness. It's this idea that we as God's people are supposed to be active, producing light in the world or shining God's light in the world because the world is full of darkness, and that we need to do our best to make sure that the light is shining and that the darkness doesn't win. Let no one deceive you with empty arguments, for God's wrath is coming on the disobedient because of these things. Verse 7, therefore do not become their partners. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth, testing what is pleasing to the Lord. Don't participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead expose them. We are told that our job as children of the light is to expose evil. Expose it. Shine a light on it. Make sure people can recognize that it is indeed evil. And when we don't, we become participants in it. There's a movement or philosophy, a thought among Christians today. Right in our houses, bring any nothing leads to disaster. David's proof of that. Our job is to expose evil. Now, I don't think that means we need to go join a... I don't think that necessarily means political activism. I don't think that necessarily means that we got to go out there and rant and rave on social media about all the ills of society and life. That's not what's being talked about either. We are to live quiet and peaceable lives. But when evil pops up around us, and we refuse to take a stand and say, no, we're not going to accept that. That's not going to be a part of our life. When we just let people engage in evil around us and we don't step up and say, hey, there's a better way to live, we are letting those people in that situation, first of all, influence us poorly. But second of all, we're letting evil flourish. Why would we do that? Why would we let the world continue to live in darkness if we have an opportunity to share with them a better decisions that they can make, ways they can find fulfillment? You've got to be careful about that. Secondly, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. There are so many passages, and really one of the themes of the whole letter that Paul writes to Titus is that we as people should be in good works. That's our mission, to do good works. We sit back and do nothing. All the good that we could do goes undone. All the influence that we could have on people who would be willing to be influenced, they never get it. All the times we could have talked about the good news of God's kingdom to people who want to hear it, it goes unheard. Because we've sat back and done nothing. My question to you is, if when you compare that to passages like James chapter 4, verse 17, to him who knows what is good and does not do it, it is sin. Can we sit back and not do the good we're supposed to do? Is that acceptable for us to sit back and do nothing? I don't know that we can. Over in Matthew chapter 25, there's this story Jesus tells about the talents. We're familiar with the story, I'm sure. Jesus tells the story of a landowner, a master who gives 5 talents to one, talents to another servant, 1 talent to a final servant. And he leaves and goes out of town, and the man with 5 talents takes master with it and does what he can, and he ends up, by the time the master returns, doubling the money. He's able to return 10 talents to the master, and the master's well pleased. And the man with 2 talents does the same thing. I don't know if he took advice from the 5-talent man, if he did his own job, his own project, his own way of doing things, but he also doubles his money, and he returns 4 talents to the master. You know the story. What's the 1-talent man do? Buries it. He does nothing. And I've found it interesting, we don't really know. What if the 1-talent man, with fear of his own failure, real hard. Would the master have rewarded that or punished it? He clearly believes the master would have punished it. But he gets punished anyway for doing nothing. For doing nothing. He at least could have tried and potentially succeeded. But instead, the safe option was to do nothing. What is it that he's told? He says, "You evil, lazy servant," in verse 26. "If you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gathered where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited the money with the bankers, and I would have received my money back with interest when I return." Then you should have done something, even the safe thing, like putting it in the bank, would have been better than burying it and doing nothing. I'm worried sometimes that we as God people are one day going to be giving an account to God, and all we're going to be doing is returning to God what God had already given to us. And I wonder, what will I hear God say? If the best I have to give to God on Judgment Day is, well, God, I didn't do any of the bad stuff, what will God say? If the best I have to give to God on Judgment Day, when I stand before the Master and He's taking account, the best I have to give Him is the bare minimum, what is He going to say? Good men do nothing, nothing gets done. We don't see any fruit, we don't see any growth, we don't see any productiveness, we don't see anything moving forward, and we should, as a result of that, be ashamed. Matthew chapter 21, verse 19. Jesus is walking early morning. He sees a lone fig tree and he goes up and he wants to get a fig from it, and he doesn't find anything on it. And so he says, "May no fruit ever come from you again." What happens to that tree? Withers up. Shrivels up. The tree that's not produced is worth. It doesn't produce fruit. What's the point of the tree? Brothers and sisters, if we're not producing fruit, what's the point? What are we doing? If we're not working to do something for God, then we deserve the same curse. David, as a young man, is extraordinary, for sure. And as a young king, he's valiant, and he makes great decisions, and he expands the borders of God's kingdom. Incredible things to solidify the borders of the kingdom, and built cities on the borders in order to protect the kingdom. And as a servant of God, he desired God's glory, and he wanted to build the house of God. And when God said, "No, you can't build my house," he still made the plans for it. He still applies for it, and he did everything that he could other than put hammer to nail. He could do to accomplish all that he could accomplish. And as a sinner, he ends up being repentant and grateful. And Psalm 51 is great proof of that. And you see him being an incredible man, as long as he's willing to be busy. But as an older king, when he's not going out to war, when he should be at war fighting with his armies, and when he's not standing up to sin in his own family because it's never really explained, he just doesn't do anything, he falls apart. I love that at the very end of his life, if you turn over to 2 Kings, he's old, he's passing the throne down to Solomon. In chapter 3, he has some words for Solomon in order to set him up as king. It's not 2 Kings, it's 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3. Here's what he says. Starting in verse 1. Actually, not even chapter 3. It's chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2. And he says this, "As for me, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, be a man, and keep your obligation to the Lord your God to walk in his ways and to keep his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees. This is written in the law of Moses so that you will have success in everything that you do and wherever you turn, and so that the Lord will fulfill his promise that he made to me. If your sons guard their ways to walk faithfully before me with all their heart and all their soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel." Did you notice how many action words were in that set of instructions? You are to walk. You are to make decisions. You are to follow. You are to obey. You are to keep all the obligations the Lord has given you. David realizes by the end of his life that action is better than inaction. And his instruction to Solomon is, get busy. Get busy. Brothers and sisters, I think the instructions are the same for us. Be busy. Let's do the good things the Lord has for us and bring him glory through the way that we live and make decisions. One of the things that you might have been inactive about is making that first commitment to God. And I don't know what it is that holds you back. I don't know what it is that stops you. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe concern that you're not ready. Let me assure you, if you have sinned and you have not had those sins washed away in baptism, you have something you need to do tonight. Be baptized. So let me broaden the invitation by if you have sinned and you have not done something about it, maybe you need prayers. And we can take care of that tonight. If we can help you get your life right before God, either through washing the sins away in baptism or by praying for you for his forgiveness, come forward and let us know.